Welcome to tonight's talk, Film Posters of Hollywood, Hollywood's Golden Age, with guest speaker Scott Eyman. I'm Kate Faulkner, Associate Curator of Education, and I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to support our exhibition-related programming. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce author, critic, and film historian Scott Eyman. Scott is the author of 15 books, including the 2014 New York Times bestseller, John Wayne, The Life and Legend, and 2 other New York Times bestsellers with veteran actor Robert Wagner, You Must Remember This, which was published in 1914, and Pieces of My Heart, which was published... 2014. I'm a little nervous. And Pieces of My Heart, published in 2008. Sorry, Scott. No. His third collaboration with Robert Wagner, I Loved Her in the Movies, was published in November 2016. Among his other books are Hank and Jim, The 50-Year Friendship of Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart, Empire of Dreams, The Epic Life of Cecil B. DeMille, which won the 2011 Richard Wald Memorial Book Award, and Print the Legend, The Life and Times of John Ford. Scott was the 2014 recipient of the National Board of Review William K. Everson Award for Film History for his body of work. His journalism and criticism work made him a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's won multiple writing awards for his biographies, featured writing, film, and literary criticism. He is adjunct professor of film history at the University of Miami and is a frequent guest for Turner Classic Movie programming, both at film festivals and on screen. He has lectured extensively around the world at the National Film Theatre in London, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, as well as the Moscow Film Theater. Scott also writes pieces for Film Comment, as well as book reviews for the Wall Street Journal. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. He is the former literary and art critic for the Palm Beach Post, and he and his wife Lynn live in West Palm Beach. Please join me in welcoming Scott Eyman.
Thank you very much. When you enumerate everything like that, I suddenly feel very tired. You put one foot in front of the other, and 40 years later, you've got all these things, and it just seems exhausting. I'm going to begin with a quote. Posters carry the DNA of their era. You're confronted with an image that is speaking directly of and from its time. And it's often speaking beautifully and gracefully, because that's the visual language of movie posters at their best. That's from Martin Scorsese. I might add, Martin Scorsese has a really good poster collection of his own. He stores it at the Museum of Modern Art. And 4 or 5 years ago, there was an exhibit of Scorsese's choice of his own favorite movie posters. And if the exhibit was any indication, he likes European posters for classic American films, as well as original release European posters for classic European films. But it's a beautiful collection, beautiful collection. There was a time when the posters for movies were as exotic and as vibrantly colorful and as enticing as the movies themselves. Actually, probably more so, because a poster is only an image, and an image can lie, but a movie relentlessly reveals its strengths and weaknesses to the audience. Now, the men and women who made movie posters were not thinking about bringing lofty aesthetics to the millions of people who would see their work. They may have known about the poster work of Alphonse Mucha or Toulouse-Lautrec, but they also would have pointed out that Mucha was working with a lot less restrictions than they were. They had one job: lure people into the theater, put butts in seats. There was a man named Charles Schlafer who was the head of advertising at 20th Century Fox for decades. And he put it very succinctly. Our main concern about a poster was, will it sell tickets? Someone had to see something in a poster that made him want to buy his ticket and rush inside. It couldn't be the copy. There should never be too much copy. It had to be a look, an urgency. Posters were the lifeblood of exhibition where it really mattered, right at the point of sale. That means that these men and women were engaged in selling the sizzle first. If there was any space or time left over, maybe they'd think about selling some of the steak as well. They did it by using brilliantly colored human faces and figures with an irresistible vitality. As one critic said, the posters mirrored the soul of Hollywood itself, which was necessary because the posters they designed and executed were the immediate connection between a California city where the dreams were made and the worldwide audience who were that city's customers and who were eager to share in those dreams. Among other things, posters promised adventure and sexual stimulation beyond the imagination of Scheherazade. They didn't start out that way. The earliest movie posters were very similar to posed, literal-minded stills that advertised legitimate theater. For instance, as you can tell, this is 1910. This is the Edison Company's adaptation of Frankenstein. It's the first version of Frankenstein that was ever put on film. They're selling nothing except Edison and Frankenstein. There's no mention of the actor. By the way, the actor is Charles Ogle, who was having a very bad hair day. And there's no mention of Mary Shelley. They're just selling Edison and they're selling Frankenstein. No stars were promoted because in 1910, in the era we're talking about, before World War I, if you gave actors publicity, actors wanted more money. They're very funny that way. So they figured if we don't give them publicity, we can pay them $5 and $10 a day and they'll go away happy. Well, that didn't last long because the business slowly came to the realization that what sold movies was not the company that made the movie and not even the title, but an actor or an actress that stimulated an affinity on the part of the audience. So in 1914, 1915, actors are beginning to get billing and they're beginning to make money to match. The great era of movie posters begins during and after World War I, as the industry moved inexorably from New York to Hollywood. The movie studios started in New York City because that's where the actors were. The problem with making movies in New York is A, there's a very limited amount of scenery, and B, you can't shoot outside for more than 4 months a year because it's 5 below zero and there's snow, and it's a little inhibiting for any other kind of landscape. Cecil B. DeMille shows up in Los Angeles in December of 1913 and looks around and says, within 2 or 3 hours' time, there's almost nothing we couldn't shoot. You had mountains, you had an ocean, you had islands over in Catalina, you had a desert, you had a city in Los Angeles. Whatever you wanted was right there outside of Hollywood. So the business slowly began migrating, which sped up after World War I. The reason the posters got better along with the movies is because the guys that followed the sun and went to California had all started as exhibitors. Louis B. Mayer, who formed MGM, he was an exhibitor. Adolph Zukor, who formed Paramount along with DeMille and Jesse Lasky, exhibitors. William Fox, Fox Film Corporation, later to be 20th Century Fox, exhibitor. They knew what put butts in seats, and they were much more aggressive about advertising the product. So 15 years after this, you had posters like this. This is better. This is much, much better. This has stars of a sort. It has an image. It has a bouquet. You kind of know, it suggests what you're going to be seeing once you pay your money to walk into the theater. It's also beautifully colored and beautifully drawn. The year that this movie came out, Adolph Zukor wrote, Paramount has found that the best results are usually achieved by large dramatic figures, brilliant coloring, and a small amount of lettering. Small figures are not favored in poster design, and all lettering that is not absolutely essential is also eliminated. Case in point. The image is far more important than the words. Paramount, which has made this picture, hired artists as diverse as Rube Goldberg, Howard Chandler Christie, James Montgomery Flagg to work on their posters. In the era that we're talking about right now, in the 1920s, there was some resistance to hiring big-name illustrators for poster work because they were like actors. If you hired a big name illustrator, they expected to sign their work because that's what illustrators did. That's how they maintained a viability in the public and build up recognition factor with the audience. But the movie executive said, well, we're paying him, it's work for hire. Why do we let him sign his work when we don't let anybody else, other artists, sign their work? Valid point. Unfortunately, that attitude didn't really change until about 10 to 12 years later in the late 30s and early 40s, when the companies began hiring artists like Norman Rockwell and some others that we'll get into in a little bit, as a signal of cultural cachet, high quality artistic intent. And there was another problem with big name illustrators. They often didn't do likenesses terribly well. Important point. If the poster didn't look like the stars it was advertising, it was a total disincentive for the audience. Knowing this, if you paid a celebrity illustrator serious money to do a poster and he kind of fudged the faces, the studios would have to have one of their staff artists in-house redo the face so that it actually looked like the actor in question. This happened more than once, as you'll see. Now, James Montgomery Flagg didn't need retouching. That's Flagg. This is 1920-21. Mabel Normand, beloved comedienne of the silent era, early silent era. She died young in 1930. It's a gorgeous likeness by Flagg. And the interesting thing is, if you look at a lot of James Montgomery Flagg's celebrity portraits, he tended to idealize slightly. Flagg's portraits are usually a little bit, the men have a little bit more hair. It's usually a bit more combed in a pompadour. The women's jewelry is absolutely sparkling. He's flattering his subjects ever so slightly. This, however, is basically just a dead-on portrait of Mabel Normand. By the 1920s, the posters were better, frankly, than most of the films. The designers and artists had devised a form that combined disproportionate vignettes to break up the space and stylistic techniques that emphasized space and movement. These techniques would grow even more sophisticated the next 20 or 25 years. Censorship arrived in Hollywood in 1934. The movies got more contained and less sexual because of the Legion of Decency and the censorship. Posters didn't, because the movies were censored, the posters weren't. So sex, which was represented metaphorically or obliquely in the films themselves, was actually much more flamboyant in the posters after the 30s. They used low-cut blouses or silk cut tightly across thighs or breasts in a way that would have been utterly impossible in the films itself. At this point, Adolf Zucker said that the future of poster art and poster advertising is unmeasured, and as competition increases, so will the value of the medium increase. He had no idea. Most of the posters on view from the Dwight Cleveland collection, Dwight, stand up and take a bow. Most of the posters from Dwight's collection cost theaters from 10 cents to 25 cents a piece to purchase. What was supposed to happen to them after the film played in the theater, you could throw them out, or you could return them to National Screen Service for credit, you know, and just it'd be an endless cycle. In fact, most were thrown out. Of course, some would get given to people who would say, my life is meaningless if I can't have this poster of Mabel Normand. And so the theater manager would hand it over. But the ultimate thing, most of them were thrown out, which accounts for their relative scarcity today. Some of them, of course, were stored in theaters. When I was a kid in Cleveland, there's a theater in Cleveland Heights called the Center Mayfield. I was an usher there. And behind the screen were speakers for the soundtrack of the films. But they also had these wooden shelves. And on these wooden shelves were stacked posters and one-sheets and lobby cards from 15 and 20 years before, as well as souvenir books from reserved seat movies that had played at the theater. I've still got some of that stuff. So in essence, what cost 20 cents or 25 cents 80 and 90 years ago now can sell for thousands of dollars based on the quality of the image, the condition of the poster, its rarity, the usual factors. The standard print run for most one-sheet posters, which is that size, 27 inches by 41 inches, was about 10,000 copies. On the low end, 7,500, on the high end, 13,000, but the median was about 10,000. A 24 sheet, which actually is a billboard, billboard sized, would go out in about 1,000 copies, which would cost an exhibitor about $2.50. Which posters survive is largely a question about the success of the film in question. The more frequently a film was booked, the bigger hit it was, the more copies of the poster are in circulation. Factor in the vicissitudes of time, and posters that really weren't supposed to be in use for more than a year or two. The studios in the era we're talking about basically only tracked income from a film for 3 years. That was the period in which they amortized the cost of the film. After that, they didn't even bother with bookkeeping. From the time a film opened in a downtown New York movie palace to the time it played its last booking in East Jesus, Arkansas, would generally take 3 years. After that, the posters got thrown out and the film negative was returned to the vault. So each studio had a very specific style in their advertising, just as they did in their films. 20th Century Fox put a lot of money into their advertising. They believed that forceful, striking posters were the most effective sales tool there was. Fox used very few taglines. They didn't want to clutter the poster. They liked images, giant looming heads, often rendered in chalk and in colors that would scorch your optic nerve. If you've ever seen a Betty Grable musical and you think, my God, I have to avert my eyes, the posters for Fox were not dissimilar in impact from the Betty Grable musical. The Fox style actually persisted into the early 1950s, long after most studios had moved on from that kind of really theatrical coloring and style. Paramount had a similar style. One primary image, avoid unnecessary type, no clutter. The word for both Paramount and Fox is lush. MGM spent the most money of all the studios on their advertising. They didn't do just one kind of poster. They took particular care with their comedies. They hired John Held Jr. to do a lot of his waggish caricatures for their MGM comedies. This is a John Held caricature from First National, 1927, 28, I believe. Held was the most popular caricaturist in the 20s. He was the equivalent of Scott Fitzgerald in fiction. Held made a lot of money. William Randolph Hearst paid him 6 figures a year. It was in a time when you could support a middle-class family on $6,000 or $7,000. So the money Held made doing posters was basically cigarette money, as far as he was concerned. MGM always tried to do something different. In the 1940s, MGM had a man named Jacques Kapralik on staff. Kapralik did, I guess you'd call it character origami. He would take construction paper and cut and fold it until it became a really impressive caricature of the MGM stars. He did these things for in-house advertising. Sometimes they appeared on one sheets, the 27 by 41 posters. They're extraordinarily well done and specific and individual. It was one of those things that set MGM posters apart from everybody else, because nobody else had a guy like Jacques Kapralik on staff. MGM also would hire Al Hirschfeld to do freelance illustrations for some of his caricatures. You could tell an MGM poster essentially by the art, by who they had to do the art. In the same way that you could tell an MGM picture by the style of the lighting and the presence of the stars. Not all of the major studios were as extraordinary as MGM. Take Warner Brothers, please. Warner spent good money on their movies. They saw no need to spend more on their advertising. Warner's posters for some of their most famous pictures are really sometimes slapdash, appallingly slapdash. They wouldn't even be bothered to pay for color. A lot of their posters are simply duotones with a picture of the star pasted on a poster against a slash of color. The Warner Brothers believed in what they call the 3S theory: simply show the star. The type in the Warner Brothers posters tended to be kind of modern and uninteresting. And this is why when you see posters from Warner Brothers pictures reproduced, they're often from foreign posters of the Warner Brothers American pictures, because the foreign posters are actually much more interesting than the American posters. The reason behind all this was that Harry and Jack Warner were cheap, really cheap. There were actually four brothers. Sam died young. Abe didn't matter. They gave him an office and a pretty secretary, and he was happy. Harry and Jack ran it. Jack ran the studio. Harry ran the corporation. And they were both cheap. Jack Warner, after 7 o'clock or so at night, would go around the office building, turning off all the lights that all his employees had left on. Harry Warner would walk around the studio a lot picking up nails so they could be reused in building sets. True story. Here's 3 posters from one of Warner Brothers' most famous pictures, John Huston's The Maltese Falcon. On the left, there's a picture of Bogart in the poster for the Maltese Falcon. The picture does not come from the Maltese Falcon. It comes from High Sierra, a picture he'd made the year before. You can tell because in High Sierra he plays a convict who's just been paroled and his hair is cropped very close to his head, and what I assume was the convict style at that point. That's the still they used. Like they didn't know the difference between, couldn't tell the difference between a still from one movie and a still from another movie. Actually, this sort of cheating was common. In one poster, the Warner Brothers put Ann Sheridan's head on Ida Lupino's body. And nobody noticed except Ann Sheridan and Ida Lupino. And Ann Sheridan was insulted because Ida Lupino was, shall we say, skinnier than Ann Sheridan, and everybody thought Ann Sheridan had suddenly gone on a crash diet and lost 12 pounds. The second poster is actually the correct image. That's a still from the film. The third poster, which is a reissue poster, Dwight, from the late 50s, my guess, is an ensemble picture, as you can see. This is Italian. It's a totally different approach to poster design than what the Warner Brothers were doing 16, 17 years earlier with their original release posters. As you can see, Bogart's there, Peter Lorre's there, Sidney Greenstreet's there, and I guess the woman with the strap loose is supposed to be Mary Astor. I don't recall that dress in the picture. This girl looks like she just rolled out of bed and she wasn't by herself. However, you sell the movie however you need to sell the movie. But you can see the difference in approach between the original Warner Brothers release posters and the Italian reissue poster. RKO, long gone studio, Howard Hughes drove it into the dust, had a specific style as well. They often used watercolors and pastels. They did particularly strong work with their film noir posters, which figures because they made a lot of film noirs. One of the illustrators that they liked to use was a guy named William Rose, who did a lot of work for Collier's magazine. Rose designed the posters for Citizen Kane as well as Out of the Past. The posters for Citizen Kane are not good because you can see they're having trouble trying to figure out how we're going to sell this picture, because Citizen Kane falls into no known genre of picture. It's a character study told in a particularly Baroque, innovative manner, but it's not a love story. It's not a thriller. What is it? And they didn't really never got a handle on how they're going to sell that picture to the American public. Out of the Past, designed by William Rose. Now, this is a fairly typical film noir poster of the period. There's Robert Mitchum. He's wearing his hat. You can't see it, but he's got a trench coat on, and he's got a cigarette dangling out of the corner of the mouth, just as we like to see Robert Mitchum. The girl is Jane Greer. It promises action, it promises romance, it promises violence. What more do you need in a movie, really? Now, when RKO had a picture that they thought required prestige handling, they'd spend the extra money and hire Norman Rockwell, for instance, who did the poster art for Orson Welles' second film, The Magnificent Ambersons. It should be mentioned that Rockwell also did some stunning work for other studios. For instance, this. The poster art for Fox's The Razor's Edge with Tyrone Power. This is probably one of my 2 or 3 favorite posters of all times. Now, why? Well, you have to understand the context. Before World War II, Tyrone Power was a romantic lead Daryl Zanuck, who ran the studio, felt he needed to toughen him up, so he began casting power in swashbucklers like The Mark of Zorro or Son of Fury. World War II arrives. Power enlists in the Marines. He spends 3 years in the South Pacific. Tough duty. He comes back. This is his first film after World War II. Now, as I said, the Fox posters tended to be really vividly colored. And here Rockwell comes in with earth tones. Grays, browns, very subtle blues. It's simply a full-length portrait of Tyrone Power. What this poster is telling the audience says nothing about the movie. What's this movie about? Well, of course, the novel was a huge bestseller. I think it's still in print after all these years. But if you hadn't read the novel, you have no clue as to what this movie is about. The poster is telling you this is a different Tyrone Power than the man you're used to. And this is a different kind of movie for Tyrone Power, without a word being used. That's a very effective movie poster. The film was a huge hit. I think largely because this poster sold the movie even to the audience that didn't know what the movie was about and might not have liked the movie once they saw it, because it's a very internal, strange kind of film about a man who's searching for goodness in life and can't find it anywhere. Movie posters were very lucrative for Norman Rockwell. 20th Century Fox paid him $42,000 for that painting. Now, $42,000 in 1946 is what, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 today? That's a lot of money for a painting, for a living artist. And it's interesting, a couple of years after this, he did a portrait of Victor Mature for DeMille, Samson, and Delilah. It's the scene where Samson's been blinded and he's pushing the pillars of the temple apart to bring it all down on top of him and the bad guys. And it's 7 feet tall. It's more than life size. It is a huge wall-size painting that would fit on that wall there. It hangs in the home of Cecil B. DeMille's granddaughter today. I can only imagine what it's worth. But I mean, he worked large. When he had a large subject, size, the size helped him project what he wanted to project. The Power picture is not that large. The actual paint portrait is not as large as the Victor Mature picture, but it is large. This period, it was a gold rush for prestige artists. Columbia hired James Montgomery Flagg to do the promotional work for Frank Capra's Lost Horizon. 20th Century Fox hired Thomas Hart Benton to do a portfolio of art for John Ford's film of The Grapes of Wrath. Benton, who was irascible on his best days, did what Benton did. He wouldn't lower himself to try to capture the faces or personalities of Henry Fonda or John Carradine or any of the other actors. He created kind of long shots with generic images of Okies whose identity is vague, and kind of capturing the sense of the visuals of the film, which is so beautifully shot by Greg Toland. And all the human beings in the Benton style seem to be afflicted with scoliosis. They're all kind of twisted and one shoulder is higher than the other. Fox was using him to position the picture as something so classy and so prestigious that it didn't even need to be advertised like any kind of conventional movie. Similarly, Fox also hired Alberto Vargas to do the posters for a Betty Grable picture called Moon Over Miami. This is part of Dwight's collection. It's a great Vargas painting. You may notice that it doesn't really look much like Betty Grable's face, but then nobody ever looked at Alberto Vargas paintings for the face. I suspect that the fact that the arm is covering most of her face was Vargas's way of admitting that he didn't get the face right. And Fox went along with it because it didn't matter. On the other hand, Charles Schlafer, the advertising director at Fox, said, "I paid Vargas a lot of money. It wasn't worth a quarter." The illustrator had to glamorize the actor, but he had to make the drawing look like him, and that Vargas could not do. But no one cared, because all Betty Grable pictures made huge amounts of money during the World War II, including this one. And hiring Vargas was simply an attempt to class up an actress that the audience didn't particularly want classed up. Part of her charm was her kind of gum-smacking lack of pretension. You know, she's a charming chorus girl, and she never pretended to be anything else. This poster though, sums up the zeitgeist of the entire period. And it's an extremely valuable poster today because of that quality, and partially because it's a Vargas. Now, artists like Benton and Rockwell got money and perks that the anonymous proles laboring in the coal mines could only dream about. One artist who designed posters for Warner Brothers at Burbank, in the Burbank studio, remembered that they worked in an unheated building, and it was so cold that the artists would cut up their original artwork and burn it in a pot-bellied stove, because that was the only way they could get warm. This is another reason why the original art for a lot of these posters simply doesn't survive, because it was piecework, it was work for hire. Sometimes the artist would reclaim it. Rockwell always got his stuff back. That was always part of his deal, which is why so much of his work survives. He didn't just let Saturday Evening Post or 20th Century Fox do with it whatever they wanted. They had to return it to him when it was done, when they were done. But a lot of artists just let it go. You'll have noticed a certain similarity in approach, if not actual style. It's what I call the big head theory of movie advertising. The stars, big heads of the stars that attempt to be iconic in a sense that this is the way the audience wants to see them and expects to see them. It relates to previous successes. This is because the movie industry of 80 and 90 years ago is completely 180 degrees different from the movie industry of today. Briefly, the product the studios sold were the stars. The movie was only the packaging for the stars. The valuable quantity, the valuable factor, was the actor or actress. This is because the audience went to the movies. Today, they go to a movie. Movie-going is no longer the American habit as it was for half a century. In the period that Dwight's collection is concerned with, the audience had a passionate attachment to given stars, and they went to see everything they were in. And that was what the studios sold. The only time the studios actually had a problem was with a recalcitrant actor who wanted to do something different, who wanted to step away from their established style or established characterization. And I'm thinking of movies like Cary Grant's None But the Lonely Heart or Tyrone Power's Nightmare Alley. Nightmare Alley is a novel by a writer named William Lindsay Gresham, very neo-realistic novel of World War II, about a con artist and a grifter who falls for his own grift and descends and descends and descends until at the end he's a geek in a freak show who bites the heads off chickens. Tyrone Power wanted to play this part. Now, he wanted to expand his skill set. He wanted to play someone in the audience where he wasn't charming. He wanted to play someone who uses his charm to manipulate and take advantage of people. And Zanuck could see the train coming down the tracks right towards him. But Power had been a good soldier. He'd always been okay with whatever Zanuck wanted him to do. Zanuck felt I probably owe him one. Power certainly felt Zanuck owed him one, so Zanuck okayed the picture. So what you got is a big head of Tyrone Power, a lot different than the one Norman Rockwell did. He's got a cigarette dangling out of the corner of his mouth. He looks tough. He looks a little sleazy. Actually, it looks a little bit like the Robert Mitchum poster from Out of the Past. Same approach. In the corner of the poster, three women are looking at him with various levels of interest. The overall effect is of something disreputable, maybe deceitful. It's a very good movie. He's very good in it. Nobody wanted to see it because that's not the way the audience wanted to see Tyrone Power. The film was a huge financial flop, just as Darryl Zanuck had expected it to be. Most of these posters were done quickly. The way they were done was this. After production on a picture was finished, the stars would spend a day or two in the portrait studio working with each other, exclusively for publicity stills or for poster art. The stills that were chosen to be worked on for poster art were generally not released to the public in the conventional way of publicity stills. And the art director would pull out the stuff that he wanted. He'd send it on to the artists they'd chosen to do the posters, who could best render them in color in whatever medium he wanted to work in. All this came with the proviso that the artist in question had to leave sufficient space for as many as 150 words of contractual boilerplate. Because by the 1940s, look at all the words. Look at all the words. completely different than the posters of 1920 and the early 30s, which are much simpler and less congested. But you had to have the director's name, you had to have the producer's name, you had to have the actors. It just got more crowded. I knew an artist, a poster artist named Harold Seroy. Harold lived in Plantation. Incidentally, his grandson, Jeff Seroy, is now the publisher at Farrar, Straus and Giroux in New York. Jeff adored his grandfather, and he was a great guy. Harold worked a lot at Paramount in the early 30s and RKO and at Fox. And he had some original pieces still when I knew him. He worked a lot in charcoal. He liked to work in charcoal. He had this head of Spencer Tracy, young Spencer Tracy, before he got gray and heavy. When he's like dangerous Spencer Tracy, and it was stunning. And Harold just did the head, and he gave it to Fox, and they plastered it on a poster, and then they gave him the piece back. And he never saw the poster. You know, it was in the era, and Harold told me that he'd have to pull an all-nighter, because they would tell him, we need this tomorrow by dinner time, 6 o'clock. So he'd pull an all-nighter, he'd do the head, he'd have the stills to work off of, he would do the portrait and then rush it to the advertising department. Most of the illustrators that are doing these pictures are in New York, because most of the illustrators were in New York, because in this era, they lived and died off the magazines. And you had to be, if you were a working illustrator, unless you were Norman Rockwell, who could live any place he wanted to, but the run-of-the-mill illustrators needed to be close to the editors and the art directors who would commission the work, you know? So, and because you had to do quick turns, it's not like you could, overnight something to Ohio or, Utah, if that's where the artist lived. You had to be there to get the jobs. So Harold was in New York. Most of these guys were in New York. Harold said he would get $100, $150, which wasn't a lot, but the hourly rate wasn't bad, and he was young at this point. When Al Hirschfeld would be called in by MGM to go do a poster, sometimes the turnaround time was so tight that he wouldn't actually have time to go back to his studio. He'd commandeer a desk in the advertising department at Lowe's offices in Manhattan, borrow some paper and a pen, and go to work. Irving Thalberg liked Hirschfeld's work. He would have Hirschfeld do the art for MGM comedies, the Marx Brothers, Night at the Opera, Day at the Races. And Hirschfeld said that when the audiences began to see the Marx Brothers the way I drew them, I knew my drawings had worked. This is a Hirschfeld of Laurel and Hardy, The Devil's Brother, 1935. And it's Hirschfeld, clearly, but his style is not locked in the way it was by the time he started doing New York Times Arts and Leisure section for 50 years. There's no Nina, for instance, You guys remember Nina? His daughter was named Nina, and he would always get her name somewhere in one of his drawings in very fine pencil line. There's no Nina here, So she was alive at this point, so I don't know if he couldn't do it because it was work for hire and MGM didn't want Nina in there or what. But anyway, Hirschfeld remembered that he would get about $50 for a drawing, which is less than unheralded artists like Harold Seroy was getting. But Hirschfeld got a lot more work out of MGM than Harold Seroy did. And he didn't mind because MGM made it easy for him. They took care of everything. They took care of all the lettering, for instance. And of course, if they liked you, they could throw a lot of pictures at you because MGM made 40 and 50 pictures a year. So 6 or 8 or 10 could go to Al Hirschfeld for the poster artist. So it was worth his while to not quibble too much about having to work at somebody else's desk and turn a drawing around quickly. Hirschfeld said this: "It was fun to do. Movie advertising was one of the few fields where you could really expand and do whatever the hell you wanted to do. You had all the freedom in the world once you understood what the obvious limitations were. As a rule, the art directors never objected to anything. No matter how abstract or crazy it wasn't like doing a magazine illustration where you've got to please the editor, the publisher, the writer, the agency, and the cleaning lady who tells you to move the head around a little bit." So it goes without saying, after sketching in the circumstances where how these posters are made, the idea that anybody would come to value them as art would have struck the people making them as ridiculous, if not completely impossible. Now, those of you who read the small print on the posters in Dwight's exhibit may have noticed something odd about the posters. A couple of the companies that make them are in New York, which is perfectly sensible. Tucher Litho, for instance, but some of the most stunning ones were printed by Morgan Litho and Continental Litho, both of which were in Cleveland, Ohio, of all places. And both of them continued manufacturing posters right through the 1940s. Cleveland, Ohio, well, there's a reason. Morgan Litho in particular had been making brilliantly colored circus posters for Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey at the turn of the century, around 1900. They could do brilliant color stone lithography to order. And this was their specialty. This was their in-house specialty. So when the movie poster business took off after World War I, they got a great deal of commissions work. Stone lithography gave particularly intense color and depth. And I don't want to get into the technical weeds because it's complicated, but just briefly. To do a stone lithograph, you had to break down the color areas into separate areas using literally limestone. The limestone was about yay, shaped like this. So you could carry it without hopefully dropping it. The limestone was roughed up first, and then the outline of the drawing was sketched on the stone with a non-grease crayon. After that, the drawing was etched onto the stone using water, gum acacia, and crucially, nitric acid. Then the stones had the gum scraped off and washed with turpentine with the ink and crayon sections preserved in stone. The plate was ready for the press. Now, this was obviously a lot of work, and it got worse because with a 3 or 4 color poster, each poster had to be run through the press 3 or 4 times. So a separate color for each run. So the color areas had to be absolutely positioned correctly, or the colors would overlap or wouldn't mesh correctly. So it was a very arduous, complicated process, expensive. So around World War II, the lithograph companies began using zinc plates instead of limestone, just for ease. And zinc was eventually replaced by aluminum. And by the end of the war, stone lithography was kind of being pushed to the exit door, and it was being replaced by basic conventional offset printing. Although the companies like Morgan and Tucher and Continental were so skillful that conventional offset could actually give a pretty good imitation of stone lithography at a much less of a price and a lot less grief in the job work. When the industry began to take posters seriously, they naturally gravitated toward firms with an expertise in brilliant colors and competence in delivery. So that's why places in Cleveland would get a lot of work. Now, in going through the exhibit, you might have noticed that foreign posters are much more daring graphically and avant-garde than the American variety. This is a function of the position that foreign countries had in terms of overall box office position. In the era we're talking about, the ratio of domestic to foreign revenue was 60-40 or 65-35, with America providing the lion's share of the money. Today it's reversed. It's 35% from America, 65% from the rest of the world, which is why countries like China are increasingly important in the movie business. Foreign countries had to honor contractual things like billing, but in terms of the graphics, since they didn't really produce that much money for a country like Czechoslovakia would throw off $30,000 or $35,000 for a fairly big film like The Maltese Falcon. Well, in the vast scheme of Warner Brothers accounting, it wasn't a big deal. They didn't care what the posters looked like in Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia could basically do what they wanted to do with their posters, which is why their posters are so far removed from what the American posters are. You might have noticed something else that's interesting. There's no particular correlation between the quality of the movie and the quality of the poster. There are some gorgeous posters for movies you have never heard of. As a matter of fact, there are movies you should never hear of. B-Westerns, for instance, which often have some of the most consistently dynamic and colorful posters. Now, this is a B-Western that Paramount made in 1927 or 28, starring Fred Thompson, who they were grooming to be their version of Tom Mix. Fred Thompson died tragically, stepped on a rake, got tetanus, and died. 4 days, bang, healthy, dead, 4 days. But this is, and the film no longer exists. This poster on the right is a conventional graphic for a Western, except for the colors, which are, whoa. The poster on the left I love because they give him his head a cubist approach. You know, it's a very sophisticated graphic approach for a B Western. Now, why did they go to this kind of trouble? And any Hopalong Cassidy Western has a poster better than almost any Warner Brothers A picture. The reason is because for a relatively inexpensive outlay, a movie poster could cover up the poverty level of production and the lack of a decent script and the lack of stars that nobody really cared about. The poster was spectacular, and it could lure especially undiscriminating audiences, and most B-Westerns were made for kids or rural audiences. They didn't get reviewed in the New York Times. So it was a way of enticing an audience in, whereas the picture itself wouldn't do it. Now, eventually, the bottom drops out. Here's an interesting statistic. In 1946, the average weekly movie attendance in America is 90 million people. 90 million people in a country that had a population of about 135 million. Everybody went to the movies, my point. In 1953, 7 years later, the average movie attendance is down to 46 million. In other words, in 7 years, the American movie industry loses half their audience. This is similar to the kind of bleed out that newspapers and magazines are having now, except it's taken much longer in the print medium than it took in the movie medium. So the movie guys, they're looking at their figures and it's like triage. They have to do something. So what they do? Well, they cut, of course, but that's not all they did. To counteract the terrible impact of television, they gave the audience what they couldn't get on television. They gave them a widescreen, color, stereophonic sound, huge production values, sex, violence, more violence. And it worked after a fashion. The audience for movies levels off at about 40 million for about 20 years. Even as the population keeps going up, the audience for movies stays the same. It doesn't go up, and it doesn't go down. It stays the same. And to stay alive, the studios also cut the roster of contract employees. Because to make 30 or 40 or 50 pictures a year, that's a factory. Every Monday, the gates open up and out comes a film. It's like, you know, the way Ford made Model A's, that's the way MGM made movies. It's mass production. So to do that, you need a lot of people to maintain the production line. Well, if you're only making 15 or 20 movies, that's a whole different vibe. You don't need all those people. So they cut actors, they cut directors, they cut writers, they hire people as they need them. And if you're going to let Clark Gable and Ava Gardner walk out the door to freelance, you're certainly not going to worry about losing 10 guys in the art department. So all the art departments were cleaned out, devastated. And this has the odd effect of bringing about the next great wave of movie poster graphics. This is American in Paris, 1951's Best Picture Oscar winner. MGM, which had always had the best posters in the business, cleaned out their art department and had a lot of lousy posters. This is not the worst poster by any means, but it's a long way down from the posters they've been doing even 10 years earlier. So what happened in the 50s with writers, with directors and producers and actors who had leverage with the audience, who could consistently draw people in, power gravitated towards them, and they weren't about to settle for crappy posters and crappy advertising that didn't do justice to the movies they were trying to make. So you had Alfred Hitchcock and Otto Preminger and Stanley Kubrick hiring people like Saul Bass to design their posters. Bass was brilliant and devised a kind of unified field theory of film advertising. He would devise a key graphic for the posters. That key graphic would often be replicated in the credit sequence of the movie itself. This is Saul Bass's design for Hitchcock's Vertigo. The spiraling design was replicated in all the posters. It's also replicated in the credit sequence, and later in the film, Jimmy Stewart has a nightmare that also uses the spiraling down effect. So Bass designed films where the film itself would reinforce the poster, and the poster would reinforce the film. And Kubrick hired him to do The Shining. Preminger hired him to do Anatomy of a Murder. All Preminger's pictures had Saul Bass designs. And Hitchcock hired him to do Vertigo, which is, I think, a wonderful film. Today, it's all gone. Movie posters are mostly photoshopped today, because if you're going to spend $250 million on a superhero movie, you got to economize wherever you can. So they just Photoshop the poster. So what we're left is this. For a time, say 50 years, we had posters that embodied and reflected the creative ferment and colorful abandon of the movies themselves. We were lucky then, and we're lucky now because we still got the movies. And if we're really lucky, we've still got the posters too. Thank you.